And now, Virgin Most Powerful Radio is pleased to present Hands-On Apologetics with renowned Catholic author and apologist, Gary Michuta.
And welcome, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virgin Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo. It's great to be with you today. Hope everybody had a happy and holy Christmas. And it's great to be back in the dojo doing apologetics once again live. And got an awesome show in store for you today. As you know, on this show, we try to keep our finger on the pulse of what's going on in the apologetics world. And many of you might not know this, but there is a kind of silent war that's been going on within the camp of those who believe in God. And that is that there are two very different approaches to proving the existence of God. One is called theistic personalism. It's championed by a very famous evangelical named William Lane Craig. And basically what it tries to prove is that God is maximally great. And this is very different from how Christians had always used philosophy to explain the existence of God. And that's called classical theism, where God isn't just a maximally great item within all of existence, but God is the one who creates and holds in existence all things. And so these very different conceptions are out there, one being popularized within evangelical circles, and the other is just classical theism that's been strong since the beginning of Christianity. And the problem with that other view, with theistic personalism, by the way, is that ultimately if you take it to its logical conclusion, you start losing certain divine attributes like God's simplicity, that God is one throughout. And ultimately, you end up with something that's not really God. Now, most of this conflict has been consigned to academia, and although you'll see certain debates on YouTube, things like that, but eventually it's going to filter down, and you're going to run into believers who will believe that God is somehow not simple, maybe even in some way in time, things like that. So we need to know the outlines of this brewing war that I think will be, I'm sure, erupting in the near future. And to help us do that, we're going to have a good friend, John Rosa of ClassicalTheism.com. He's going to be coming on the show. By the way, John is the author of One Less God Than You, a fantastic book. Maybe sometime before the new year, I'll give my recommends for new books in apologetics. And we're going to be talking about answering objections to classical theism. So he'll be coming up on the other side of the break. Meantime, on this side of the break, as always, we will have a finding of fallacy. Today's finding of the fallacy, by the way, is the inflation of conflict fallacy. And also we meet an early church father. Today's early church father is a very early one. It's a work known as the Shepherd of Hermas. So that's going to be our early church fathers for today. So why don't we begin like we always do, welcoming all of you into the dojo area before we begin our workouts. I want to welcome all of you watching live stream, Facebook, YouTube, all the other platforms we live stream on. Great to see familiar names there in the chat room on YouTube. Also, I want to welcome all of you listening on radio and also listening via podcast, either through our handy-dandy phone app or through our flagship website, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. Got lots of great stuff. In fact, before I begin, I want to point out a couple of things you need to mark your calendar with. These are awesome resources, and they're free, by the way. One upcoming virtual conference, so you don't have to leave the comfort of your own home or the safety of your own home or whatever. It's put on by Steve Ray, and it's called The Take and Read, A Journey into the Bible. Now, Bible, of course, is very important in Christian Catholic apologetics. We need to know our scripture. And so there's this huge conference that Steve Ray's putting on. And just reading the guests that are going to be at this conference, it reads like a guest list of Hands-On Apologetics and more. We're going to have Scott Hahn, El Cresta, Jeff Cavins, Of course, Steve Ray is going to be there, Father Larry Richards, Frank Pavone, Teresa Tomeo, John Martinoni, John Bergsma, Marcus Grodi, Liv Lev, Dr. Edward Suri, some really big names, Father Joseph Fessio. That's going to be January 8th through 10th. Check it out. You can go to CatholicConvert.com. That's Steve Ray's website. And immediately you'll see the banner. You can plug into that conference. Very, very informative, great guest, and also yours truly will be there, so I'll lower the standards. Also, another thing, you need to mark your calendars for this one, January 16th, right here on Virtual Most Powerful Radio. We go to the YouTube channel. They're going to live stream their amazingly popular and powerful Spiritual Warfare Conference 7, which is called God's Patrimony and Man's Anarchy. So January 16th, 2021, market calendars, folks. Go to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. You can see a live stream. Both of those things are free. Both of those things are information-packed and I think very important for us to tap into, if you will. So why don't we begin with our Finding the Fallacy for today. Today's Finding the Fallacy is called the Inflation of Conflict Fallacy. And the reasoning that because authorities cannot agree precisely on an issue, no conclusions can be reached at all, and minimizing the credibility of authorities as a result. In other words, this is a kind of black and white thinking. So either all authorities agree exactly on the same point, or else it can be thrown out the window, or we can know nothing about the subject. So this occurs a lot. Occurs also a lot with atheists, especially looking at historical documents, things like that. Inflation of conflict. So that's our Finding the Fallacy for today. Why don't we jump into the Meet the Early Church Father, who is a very, very early church father. He's an apostolic father. We don't know much about this guy, but his name is Hermas. The Muratorian fragment is responsible for the information that Hermas, the author of The Shepherd, was the brother of Pope St. Pius I, who reigned sometime around AD 140-155. So he's actually a brother of a very early pope. From the Shepherd of Hermas itself, a few other items of curious information reveal themselves about Hermas. For example, he was a slave and afterwards a freeman. He had a farm on a highway between Rome and Cumae, but it was lost in business reverses. His children apostatized and betrayed him in the persecutions. His wife had an unbridled tongue and was generally shrewish. And in fact, we know quite a bit of these little details about him. But as far as hardcore information about him and his life, not so much. So that's the background to Hermas. As I said, there is only one authentic work that comes from this individual. It's known as The Shepherd. And The Shepherd is a rather lengthy work belonging to the category of apocryphal apocalypses. The work consists in 3 large sections. The first divided into 5 chapters called Visions, the second into 12 chapters called Mandates, and the third into 10 chapters called Parables. The work is important for its ethical concepts and for its bearing upon the sacrament of penance. Now, accepting the statement that the anonymous author of the Muratorian fragment, that the work was written in Rome by Hermas, by the brother of Pius, who was bishop, it is a special, it also seems to be confirmed in certain remarks he does within this book. Hermas appears to be writing while Clement was still alive, and this is a problem that patrologists have pointed out, that Clement of Rome, who is referred to, cannot be doubted. The difficulty is, how can he be a brother of Pius and yet also be writing during the time of Clement of Rome? The difficulty is usually obviated by stating hypothetically that Hermas wrote some part of the work earlier, only bringing it to completion during his brother's pontificate. Even if we accept the usual date for Clement of Rome, which would be 90 to 101 AD, it gives us a lifespan. Gives us a span of 40 to 60 years for this writing of the work. and having taken an earlier date for Clement's reign. This is, by the way, from Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers, who takes a very early date for Clement's reign as Pope, which was sometime around 80. That seems problematic to the author. However, he says, in a work obviously much fictionalized, or at any rate apocalyptic and visionary genre, there seems to be no good reason why we can't suppose that Hermas may have introduced the name of Clement for a number of hidden or symbolic reasons, perhaps only by way of implying that the vision that it came to him when he was in his youth, or perhaps by way of adding a semblance to the antiquity of his work. There's no single manuscript, by the way, that preserves the entire work. It's actually a collation of various fragments from Greek and other languages as well. And I'd also like to point out, oddly enough, the early church fathers, some locations seem to have accepted the Shepherd of Hermas as part of the New Testament. At least it was hanging around on the fringes of the canon for quite a bit, until eventually it kind of fell off the radar screen. So it was very widely accepted, at least in some locations, reverently accepted as a work, and there's all sorts of interesting goodies in that work. I wish we had more time to dive into them, but as you know, time is fleeting, especially here in the dojo. It just seems time flies. So anyway, coming up on the break, we are going to be talking about how to answer objections against classical theism by the purveyor of classicaltheism.com, John Rosa. Coming up next. Stay tuned, folks. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Genesis 1:27 says, God created man in his own image. Male and female he created them. According to Pope St. John the 23rd, it is not true that some human beings are by nature superior and others inferior. All human beings are equal in their natural dignity. May God help us to look upon everyone as a person created in his image and likeness, and treat everyone the same without favoritism or prejudice.
Did you know my mom's gonna have a baby?
She is? Will it be a boy?
Or will it be a girl? We don't know yet, but we heard the heartbeat and my dad said this is gonna be someone very special.
You mean like being a president?
Or maybe a doctor. Well, probably maybe like a singer or dancer, I think.
Hello, my name is Mary Ann Koharski. I'm the director of Pro-Life Across America. We know that every baby is a miracle and has the potential to do great things. If you know someone who is pregnant or in need of alternatives or assistance, or would like to support the work of Pro-Life Across America, please call 1-800-366-7773 or visit our website at prolifeacrossamerica.org. Pro-Life Across America is non-political and totally educational.
Pro-Life Across America, the Billboard people.
This is Terry Barber. I want to thank you for your support here at Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Here's an easy way to do it. If you're going to sell or buy a house, call Real Estate for Life, 877-543-3871, because they're going to get you a Christ-centered agent to purchase your home or to sell your home. And at the close of escrow, a portion of his commission goes right back to Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Call 877-543-3871. Thank you so much for your support.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. And we're going to be talking about defending classical theism. Like I said, there is this brewing, I think, kind of war going on with academia, two very different approaches to proving the existence of God. You have classical theism and also this idea of theistic personalism. And to help us defend classical theism, we have the classical theist himself, John DeRosa. John DeRosa, by the way, has an undergraduate degree in math education at the College of New Jersey and an MA in Pure and Applied Mathematics, Mount Clair State University. He is the purveyor of the amazingly popular website, which is classicaltheism.com. He's also the author of a fantastic book, and if I do my apologetic picks for the new year, this will definitely be on my top 10 list, if not my top 5 list. It's One Less God Than You, How to Answer the Slogans, Cliches, and Fallacies that Atheists Use to Challenge Your Faith. Here's the cover, and it's put out by Catholic Answers Press. Fantastic book. And John, hey, welcome back to the dojo. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas, Gary Machuda. It is always a pleasure to speak with you. Thank you so much for having me back today.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Just because, let's talk a little bit about your website before we jump into our material, because your website is just packed with great information, not only on theism, but also Christian apologetics and Catholic apologetics.
Yeah, so we divided up into 3 pillars. And I'll tell you what, when I started this in 2018, I anticipated having blog posts myself and doing a lot of solo podcasts. And I did some of that in the beginning. But what I found is what's most beneficial is let's find all these experts in the Catholic world, whether they're philosophers, historians, theologians, people who have decided, who've studied niche issues like the Deuterocanon, like yourself, and let's bring them on to help defend 3 core pillars of the Catholic Christian worldview: that God exists, that Jesus is our Lord and Messiah, and that he founded the Catholic Church. And so at first I'm like, maybe I could research all this stuff on my own, but then I'm like, hey, wait a minute. Why don't I just find great experts in each of these areas and kind of bring them on and harvest the different nuggets that they've discovered in their own arguments and their own evangelization? And that's what the Classical Theism podcast is all about.
Yeah, and it's awesome. It's going strong. And, man, I'm a frequent listener because I'm always learning new things. We have I kind of set it up in the first segment that there is this 2 very different approaches to proving the existence of God. And in some ways, in my humble opinion, I think the theistic personalist approach has some very grave problems with it. And ultimately, as us as God believers, especially Catholics defending the classical theism position, we're going to have to answer objections, aren't we?
We are going to have to answer objections. And why don't I start by defining some of the terms that you've been talking about, and then maybe see if I can even nuance the situation, because the field of play is a little even more complex than when Father Brian Davis first coined his terms, classical theism and theistic personalism, in his Intro to Philosophy of Religion book, which is a great textbook that's used in a lot of philosophy classes. But people want to know what we're talking about. So what do we mean by classical theism? And then what are some of these alternative approaches? And obviously on my show, Classical Theism Podcast, we tend to defend that view. So basically I would start with classical theism being the traditional conception of God where he's the metaphysically ultimate ground of all reality. And he explains why anything and everything exists in its most ultimate sense, and as long as it exists. And grains of this view can be found in a lot of different contexts, such as, Plato had his idea of the good. Aristotle has the unmoved mover. Plotinus is a Neoplatonic philosopher. He had his idea of the one. And we could say broadly, they all had aspects of pointing to this fundamental foundation of reality that we end up calling God in the Christian context. And in a Christian context, we have people like Athanasius, Augustine, and it really reached its apex in the thinking of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I've had both Catholics and Protestants on my show who have told me that. They said, yes, classical theism, it was organically started in the early church, but then it really reached its apex in the medieval scholastics, in particular Aquinas, who developed and brought out this theory even more. But in a Jewish context, you can find rabbis like Maimonides defending it. And in a Muslim context, there's famously people like Avicenna and Averroes who defend a classical theism. Okay, so those are people who defend it. What's more about it, though? Well, in addition to God being metaphysically ultimate and necessary, as well as we would hold all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, classical theists maintain, we could say, like 4 additional attributes: that God is absolutely simple, immutable, impassible, and eternal. And so what distinguishes classical theists from those other conceptions of God is those distinct attributes: simplicity, immutability, eternity, impassibility. But so that's one thing, is we kind of hold to those other attributes because we see them as directly tied to God's ultimacy and his perfection. But there's a second way in which I'll distinguish them, in that the way that classical theists think about God is we don't simply use the model of a rational creature. And some of these other conceptions of God, they'll even say this explicitly. We think of God on the model, on the representation of a rational creature. So we kind of think about rational creatures, and then we ratchet up all the attributes and analyze him kind of in that kind of same univocal thinking approach. Whereas classical theists are going to be much more interested in maintaining that God is, yes, he's all these attributes, we can say true things about him, but he's radically distinct from creation. We affirm that creator-creature distinction and say that God radically transcends us, and ultimately we cannot grasp or comprehend what the divine essence is in this life, but we could say true things about it. We can say, even as far to say that he's personal and loving, but we have to always recognize that when we make those attributions, we're doing so either analogously or simply making statements in an extended sense that doesn't limit him to being a person just like we are. And so classical theists, I would say, we adopt that form of thinking rather than he's univocally a person. Now, let me just say one more thing about the idea of theistic personalism, and I'll let you follow up on any of this if you want, because some people have pushed back. They've said, oh, that's just a pejorative. Like, you're saying we believe God is just like Zeus. And maybe there are some theists out there who do conceive of God as just like a Zeus-like figure flying around in the sky. But more commonly nowadays, there's what I've come to see is that theistic personalism might be a little too simplistic, because there's all these different kinds of theism. People use the words like process theism, saying that like God can change in his engagement with the world and become, emotional in various respects. There's also this term neoclassical theism. But what I would say all of these words have in common is they in some way will say we're rejecting or modifying those classical attributions, that God is absolutely simple, immutable, eternal, and impassible. They don't think those can work, but as classical theists, we're like, well, we don't think we need to modify them because we think they do work. We think we have good grounds to believe them, and we think that they provide us a great ground of our worship and awe of God, and help us avoid, idolatrous temptations to think of God as just another creature. So that's an overview, probably a long overview of classical theism.
No, that's great. And yeah, I think a very succinct summary indeed. Yeah, John, and for me, I'm an apologist kind of guy. I'm always looking at it in terms of arguments and their power to persuade. And I have to say that theistic personalism has the upper hand because it's easier to imagine. It's easier for somebody to grasp, where classical theism really forces you to rely purely on reason and cast out imagination.
Well, let me say a word about that, because I'd say that's partially right. I think it's definitely, you're right. It's easier to imagine God as more like us than more different than us. But I will say the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's very clear. Paragraph 43, it says, we can affirm no similitude between God and us without also at the same time affirming a greater dissimilitude. Or as my priest told me in college, God is more unlike us than he is like us, for any like thing we could say. And that could be a tough pill to swallow if we're just trying to imagine and think about God. But I would say not only do we have the metaphysical reasoning, so how do we get to the God of classical theism? We use traditional metaphysical reasoning, such as employed in an argument from the unmoved mover, the first way, or a contingency argument. These things start with premises that can be known metaphysically, that everything moved from potency to act requires something already in act to move it from potency to act, or a contingency argument that every contingent thing, must receive its existence from something outside of it, or every contingent thing requires a cause. And we use these kind of metaphysical arguments to trace back to an ultimate ground of something that's already and always in act, or something that in no way needs a cause that exists metaphysically necessarily. And we can argue that the traditional attributes fall out of that. But I'll say the other two ways we can get to classical theism, maybe some people don't think these are as strong, but I think they're pretty good. One is, well, the church tells us. And as Catholic Christians, if we're faced with competing models of God and we're like, man, which one of these do I go with? Well, it's kind of like if we're faced with competing models of the doctrine of justification and we're like, I don't know Greek and Hebrew and can't adjudicate all these disputes. Which one do I go with? Well, Christ founded a church to guide us into all truth. And I think at the Fourth Lateran Council and the First Vatican Council, they taught that God is absolutely simple, is incomprehensible in various ways, immutable, and roughly a doctrine of classical theism. Now, there is some leeway into how those attributes can be cashed out. We could talk about that a little bit in the next segment. There is some leeway with how to understand these. Not everyone has to understand the doctrine of divine simplicity in the exact same Thomistic way, though I do think the Thomistic way is the best. The church allows for a little bit of leeway there in understanding the attributes, but I think we have warrant through the ecclesiastical authority that Christ laid down for us that we should go with classical theism. And then we also have those metaphysical arguments. And then there's a third layer of support. I would even point to certain scriptural passages, though there's always going to be debate there, that stress God's transcendence. We have, I am who am in Exodus 3:14. We have Romans 11:36 when he says, he is from, God is that which is from him, and to whom, and through whom are all things. I'm botching the quote a little bit, but you get the idea. Acts 17, in him we live and move and have our being. All of these can be interpreted in a classical theistic light. So I think we have good warrant even beyond just the metaphysical arguments.
Yeah, very good. So, let's jump into objections. Now, the break's coming up, so I think maybe if you could just phrase the objection, and then that would be a great cliffhanger, and then we'll come back and address it. What's the first objection to simplicity?
Yeah, so divine simplicity says that God is not composed in any way, that he is absolutely simple. And the objection says, well, don't you Christians believe that God has a whole variety of attributes like goodness, wisdom, power, holiness, mercy, and so forth? And if so, then isn't he a complex essence with all these different properties and powers rather than just one absolutely simple thing? And Alvin Plantinga famously leveled an objection like this, and some people think it's a good reason to deny divine simplicity. So that's the objection. How can he have all these multiplicity of attributes if he's absolutely simple?
All right, very good. We're chatting with John DeRosa, author of One Less God Than You, also classicaltheism.com. Stay tuned, folks. You'll hear the answer to that objection and others right after this.
Help the Helpless, a Minnesota St. Paul nonprofit organization chaired by Father of Tyr and volunteers, is humbly asking you for your kind support to help the poor and the handicapped children in India and Ecuador. Through financial support from the Help of the Helpless benefactors, the children are provided with clothing, food, education, shelter, and the teachings of the Catholic Church. The mission is to help children thrive and become self-sufficient young adults leading productive lives. We also provide aid to poor families in Ecuador with food baskets, medicines, medical assistance, and help with funeral needs for the deceased. The work in India is done by Father Antonio's organization, St. Mary's. In Ecuador, the work is being done by the Servant Sisters of the Home of Mother. You can call us at 877-762-8857. To learn more, please visit our website, www.helpthehelpless.org. God bless you.
If you shop on Amazon.com, there's an easy way to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio. Just visit smile.amazon.com and type in Catholic Resource Center under the desired charity. Now, when you log into your Amazon account and purchase products, a portion of it will automatically go to support Virgin Most Powerful Radio at no cost to you. Thanks in advance for supporting CRC and VMPR, and may God richly bless you and your family.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow! That's 80%! realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
This is Jesse Romero. You're listening to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda on Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We are chatting with John DeRosa of ClassicalTheism.com, and we're talking about objections to the classical approach to proving God's existence. And John, so we had a nice cliffhanger there about the simplicity of God, that God is one throughout, individual, no parts. Yet, as you posed in your objection, but Christians say God is good and he's wise and he's powerful and he's holy. Doesn't this imply some sort of complexity within God?
All right. It's a great objection. It's the first objection I think we got to tackle. And I think the short answer is yes, we believe in all of those traditional attributions that God is good, wisdom, power, holiness, mercy, and so forth. But we deny that making such predications violates God's absolute simplicity. And I'm going to explain how we make that work. But it's true to say that wisdom, let's just take wisdom and power. Those are distinct attributes in created human beings, or created beings, we could say, such that, a person could be wise and not very powerful. Maybe they're just like some, super smart and wise person and studied and holy, but, they're a monk who is aged and doesn't have a lot of power in the sense of physical power. But also we can envision someone who is super strong and very powerful, but not very wise. So it seems they can come apart, so to speak, when we think of wisdom and power. So therefore we think that they must be distinct things, and we apply this reasoning even to God. But the key is when we speak of the God of classical theism as being good and powerful, we're going to deny that these are attributions made on a spectrum where God is just like another created being, and he's one that's the most powerful. His power is a different kind than ours, and his wisdom is a different kind than ours, such that the one rich, simple being that is God, it's true to say of that he is powerful because, there's foundation in his nature. There's something analogous to power in that he can bring things about. But it's also true to say that he is wise because, again, analogously in his nature, there's some foundation for saying that he has wisdom in the ordering of his divine plan of creation. So what we're going to say, and this kind of just sounds like assertion so far, but I'm going to give you a good example to help back up the point. Whatever God's godness turns out to be, whatever the divinity turns out to be, is so supreme that it's true to say of it that it's wise, and it's also true to say of it that it's powerful, yet saying both of those things doesn't require that wisdom is equal to power. And Dr. Eleanor Stump is a great example for this when she talks about the example of light in physics. And she says, when we learn about light, think of like a high school physics class or even a college physics class. And I can remember people talking about this on my campus. I would even ask my physicist friends, well, hey, is light a wave or is it a particle? And there's like these two different kinds of things in physics, waves and particles. But it turns out the physicists have decided, well, sometimes it makes sense to talk about light as a wave, and other times it makes sense to talk about light as a particle. But we know that particles are not waves and waves are not particles. So how do we put this together? Well, it turns out that whatever light turns out to be, it's the sort of thing that sometimes it makes sense to talk about as a wave, and sometimes it makes sense to talk about it as a particle. So similar with God's absolute simplicity. Again, it's not on the par with our own wisdom and power. It exceeds that. But whatever God's absolute transcendent nature turns out to be, it will be true of it that it's true to say that it's powerful, and it's true to say that it's wise. I'll give one more example, just as a math teacher. Picture like a cone, all right? Like a regular right cone, geometry, a 3D solid. Well, if you're looking at that cone, let's say straight on in a two-dimensional way from a frontal view, what's it going to look like? Straight on frontal view, you're looking at a cone on the table, but you only have a two-dimensional look directly spot on from the front. Well, if you're picturing this like I am, it's going to really just look like a triangle in 2 dimensions of that cone. Okay? But now go to a top view, and you're looking, so to speak, from the bird's eye view, and the cone is, resting on a flat surface pointing up, and you look down upon this cone. What's it going to look like? Well, it's going to look circular. So is this cone a triangle? Is this cone a circle? No. But in the cone is foundation for us attributing to the fact that in one aspect, the cone looks triangular from one view, and in another aspect, the cone looks circular from another view, but the cone is really just one object in itself. Now, of course, these are just, created examples. They're always going to fall short of the God of classical theism, but I think those will help see how this objection, it doesn't follow from the fact that we attribute multiple attributes to God, that we can make multiple true predications. It doesn't follow that his divine nature is actually complex. It just means that there's foundation for us making these analogously true predications from our created vantage point. That's how I would answer the objection.
Yeah, very good. There's a second objection to simplicity that's just too good to pass up. So maybe we could do that, and then we can move on to immutability. But this is very common. How can God be simple if there's a Trinity? That there's 3 persons, one God.
No, I think that's a big one, and we're going to have to tackle it. And I think I'll say a little bit more about what divine simplicity means first, because I kind of just said it very quickly. Divine simplicity means that we deny that God is composed in any way of, let's say, material parts, matter and form, substance and accidents, essence and existence. And in article or question 3 of the Summa and the Prima Pars, which is the first book, Aquinas goes through all these different ways that created reality can be composed. And he says, we deny this of God. But notice what I said there. He goes through all the different ways that created reality can be composed, and says God can't be composed in that way. Well, we must recognize that when we say God is absolutely simple, that's really what we mean. And the reason for that, one of the metaphysical reasons, is that, well, if he were composed in those ways, then he would be in some way dependent on his parts for his existence. But if we want to say God is the fundamental ultimate reality, then he must be the deepest unity there. He must be the ultimate explanation of all that exists. And he can't depend on anything else, even his parts that make him up, to be what he is. Otherwise, we would lose the fact that God is the ultimate necessary being. And this is where we're led with contingency arguments, Aristotelian proofs. Father Bernard Lonergan has some great arguments along this score where he gets to God as an unrestricted act of understanding. So that's like cosmological reasoning gets us there. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, the doctrine doesn't flat out say we're never allowed to make any distinctions regarding God. Now, it's true he's not multiple substances. He's not 3 gods. He's not one substance with multiple accidents. We deny all of those. Those would be Trinitarian heresies. However, if God reveals within the one absolutely simple being that is God, there exist 3 co-equal and co-eternal persons who each possess the plenitude of the divine nature, such that they're each the one simple God, yet they're distinct by relations of origin. If God tells us this through scripture, tradition, and magisterium, then we can believe this on the authority of him revealing, even if we can't see with our mind's eye what the Trinity looks like. So we deny that the Trinity leads us to affirm any complexity in the sense of created beings being complex. But there is a mysterious multiplicity going on where each of the divine persons are really distinct from one another, yet are equal to and possess the plenitude of the divine essence. Now, let me just add this on the. So the first thing to say is that our philosophical reasoning is on a distinct plane where we're led to God as absolutely simple, but then we're given revealed information from scripture, tradition, and the church that God is a trinity of persons. This revealed information kind of trumps or supersedes what we may have thought philosophically. That's not to say it contradicts what we thought philosophically, but that our philosophical principles are not fine-grained enough to pick up these Trinitarian distinctions. And we don't really fully grasp what they are. They're only what the personal, triune personal God could reveal, could tell us about himself. We can never get there on our own from the philosophical realm. And let me add a little bit more to make this coherent. It should be kept in mind that the formulation of the doctrine of the Trinity always tracked historically the doctrine of divine simplicity, such that the sort of absolute simplicity being affirmed, it's not so overly strong as to preclude the Trinitarian distinctions. Okay, a doctrine of divine simplicity that's so strong it says you're not allowed to make Trinitarian distinctions. Well, quite frankly, that's too strong, and it would have been rejected by Athanasius, Aquinas, Anselm, Boethius, and all those who affirm Trinitarian monotheism. So these guys understood what they were saying when God was absolutely simple, and so their notion of absolute simplicity always went alongside affirming that God is a Trinity, and that gives us prima facie reason to think they're compatible. Lastly, I'll state this. The Fourth Lateran Council opens up by saying both, literally in like the same couple of sentences, that God is absolutely simple and that he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And since we don't think the fathers outwardly embrace like flat out contradictions, like that's just the first thing they're going to say is X and not X, then this gives us other evidence to think that the Trinitarian distinctions are of a different type that don't violate the absolute divine simplicity present in the Catholic tradition. Now, one final technical note I'll add, there are different ways to cash out divine simplicity. So I follow the more Thomistic side of things, but Blessed John Duns Scotus also has a way of talking about divine simplicity, a Scotistic form of it, which the church has not said this is heretical. They've said that, that's in bounds as far as orthodoxy is concerned. And even Gregory of Palamas in the East, in the Eastern Orthodox context, some people interpretations of him will say he violates the doctrine, but I actually saw a PhD dissertation by a Dominican priest who said that there are interpretations of Palamas that are actually within Catholic orthodoxy of affirming absolute divine simplicity, but he explains it in a different way. So long story short, there are varying ways within the Christian tradition to cash this out, but the short answer is the types of composition being denied in the affirmation of divine simplicity are not entailed by the distinction of Trinitarian persons. And we're not going to fully grasp that because we don't fully grasp the Trinity and we don't fully grasp God, but we can say enough to say they're not in conflict.
All right, very good. Yeah, that's it's so common that you'll hear this objection, and I know a lot of Catholics get kind of tied up with it. So that's a great explanation. We're chatting with John DeRosa, author of One Less God Than You, available through Catholic Answers Press. But we're talking about answering objections to classical theism in this program. More to come on the other side of the break. Listen to Hands on Apologetics.
Welcome, Daniel.
Hi, this is
You're on the
Jesse
line. What's
Romero
on your
for the
mind,
Terry
brother?
Jesse.
Hi, I just wanted to share a testimony about Virgin Most Powerful Radio. I had a buddy at work who, he's a lukewarm Catholic guy, and I wanted him to start listening to the Terry and Jesse show, so I kept telling him to download the app, and he kept putting me off. So one day, I grabbed his phone and I downloaded the app for him. I went on vacation, and I kept telling him to listen to it. He was kind of put me off. I came back from vacation. He comes to my cubicle, and he says to me, "Hey, man, I've been listening to Terry and Jesse's show, and it's great." And it's made a big impact in his life. The guy, he's going to weekly adoration a couple times a week. He goes to the Mass in the morning. He's an on-fire Catholic, and he promotes the Terry and Jesse show in the Virgin Most Powerful Radio.
Daniel, what a testimony. And I want to encourage our listeners to get those cards by going to virginmostpowerfulradio.org and do what Daniel's doing. Go out and spread the faith by inviting people to listen to Virgin Most Powerful. Daniel, thanks for your testimony, brother. God love you.
You're welcome.
In 1 Corinthians 13:13, St. Paul says, "So there abide faith, hope, and love, these three." According to St. Ignatius of Antioch, faith is the beginning and love is the end. And God is the two of them brought into unity. Then comes everything else that makes up a Christian. May God grant that we may attain all the virtues that make for authentic followers of His Son.
Buying or selling your home or your business property? This is Terry Barber. Real Estate for Life underwrites the Terry and Jesse Show. And they can connect you to one of 900 pro-life real estate agents around the world. And when they receive their referral fee, they will give 80% of it to a pro-life organization. Wow, that's 80%. realestateforlife.org, 877-LIFE-US1.
Now, back to Hands-On Apologetics with Gary Machuda. If you'd like to join the conversation, call 888-526-2151. Here's Gary.
And welcome back, everybody. Hands-On Apologetics. We're chatting with our good friend, John DeRosa of ClassicalTheism.com. If you haven't checked it out, please go, because it's just packed with great information. And, John, you know, there's so much we want to cover in this program, and time is gone. Maybe we could address one thing in terms of mutability, then go to divine impassibility. Then I want to talk a little bit about modal collapse, because you hear that a lot. If you can do it, you know, we'll see if you're up to it.
I'll try to keep my answers more succinct this time so we can get to those three issues. Let's do it.
All right. Yeah, and if anyone wants to learn more, they could go to ClassicalTheism.com. Yeah, so one objection would be, if God is absolutely unchanging, then how could he do anything? I mean, wouldn't he essentially be frozen in place because he could never change out of Egypt? Be the frozen thing out there in, outside of creation.
Yes, and there's a famous critique from a philosopher who referred to the God of classical theism, I think, as a metaphysical iceberg. I think Clark Pinnock said that once in the 90s. Let's take this objection, and I'll try to be as succinct as I can. The key to understanding that God's absolute and unchanging is tied up with the idea that he's perfect and complete in himself, lacking in nothing. Okay? So, but just because, and here's the key, just because he cannot and does not change in his own intrinsic perfect nature, because he's already perfect love, that doesn't mean he can't produce things outside of himself, and that's what he does when creating the world. So what this objection usually assumes is that anyone who does anything, they have to change in the course of doing that action. And since God creates the world, he redeems sinners, he brings the Israelites out of Egypt, well, he must be moving in his own intrinsic nature in order to bring about that change. But this commits what Dr. Edward Fazer calls a fallacy of accident. Just because the actors that we're acquainted with produce their effects in the course of changing themselves, it doesn't mean that all causes must produce their effects in that same way. And I think I've given this example on the show before, but I'll give it again because I find it vivid and helpful. Suppose I said all college professors in the United States are under 8 feet tall. Okay? And then I reasoned, well, therefore, any college professor must be less than 8 feet tall. Now, I know Gary Machuda is pretty tall, but even he is less than 8 feet tall. But this would be committing a fallacy of accident, because it's actually not an essential feature of being a college professor that you have to be less than 8 feet tall. And, you know, one day, if there were someone who were 8 feet or more in height and they became a college professor, well, then it would be true that we have a college professor who's 8 feet tall. So we can't reason just because it's true in all the cases we're acquainted with that that's part of something's essential nature. Similarly, in the case of divine action, we must zero in on the idea that doing things and performing actions, what's the essential element involved in that? Well, Father Brian Davis points out it's not that the actor changes. That's not the essential element in action or causing or bringing about effects. The essential element is that whatever's doing the causing or doing the action has the ability to produce an effect. So what we say is, it's not an essential component of the action that the subject producing the effect must also change. And so in the case of God, he can produce effects in other things even while undergoing no change in his own essence. So we say when he creates the world, when he brings the Israelites out of Egypt, when he redeems a sinner, this is all on the side of creation. God is doing it. However, he is so powerful in a way that we can't grasp that he can cause other things to come about without himself changing. And if you say he can't do that because none of us can do that, well, that's just a fallacy of accident. So I don't affirm that God can do nothing. I affirm that in his immutable, unchanging, perfect nature, he can do incredible things, and he has done those things in salvation history. That's my short answer.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Also, the objection to divine impassibility. If God's impassible, then how can it be said that he loves his creatures?
Right. And we do want to affirm that God is love. Right? 1 John 4, it says that God is love. He loves his creature. Love entails willing the good of another. But if God is impassible, what do we mean by impassible? Usually it's taken in two ways. One way is that God cannot be causally affected, or some other people will say that God does not have emotions like we have emotions. This can get a little technical because like how you define emotion, some people might end up defining the fact that, well, it could be true in some sense to say that God has an emotion. He has a perfect, blissful, beatific vision, emotion of loving himself in the Trinity. Okay, so we can get into quibbles about words there and how you define emotion. But nonetheless, God doesn't change and he can't be affected by his creatures. So how can he like love us in that like vivid, passionate way that we want to be loved? And so here's what I would say. The objection assumes, and with all these objections, I like to go to the heart and the principle that we're going to deny as classical theists. The objection assumes that one can only love by being moved or roused into that love. So, for example, when my wife, Christine, when I was, asking her out on dates and I was very into her at first. And later on talking about it, she was like, well, I wasn't quite sold on you at the start. After just like 2 or 3 dates, I was like super into her, but she wasn't really sold on it. But then like 5-6 months down the road, she came to recognize our loving relationship, and then eventually we got married. But the point is, we were both kind of moved into that love over time, over the course of a process of things unfolding. That's part and parcel of creaturely love. I think that's normal and that's natural. And I was attracted to her loveliness, and she needed to be sold on quite a few things about me. There's even a famous story I'll tell you at some point, but after our second date, she was like, no way, this ain't going anywhere. But I was persistent. I was very persistent. Nonetheless, here's my point. What if God can love and care in a passionless way that is actually more intense and more real than the transient human love that we engage in? And this is where I'd recommend the writings of Father Herbert McCabe when he talks about God's love. But the idea is that God doesn't need to work up ushy-gushy feelings inside of himself in order to then love us. The idea is that God is already an intense, unchanging, perfect love towards us that can never be altered. And he was always that impassible, perfect love towards us. Now, we might experience that in different ways, but on God's side, that is always the same. When we sin, we experience that impassible love as condemnation, justice, wrath. But there's no change in God's part. It's just we're not acting in accord with how we were made to be and how he was giving us the grace to be. We just chose to turn against him. But he loved us all the time. And when we repent, we experience God's impassible love as forgiveness and mercy. But again, he loved us all the time in an unchangeable way. So I would say the objection assumes that in order to love, one must have an emotional, cognitional, passionate, changeable attitude. But we just deny that needs to be the case in order for God to love us perfectly.
Very good. Well, yeah, let's talk about modal collapse. I've heard this a lot. I'm not quite sure I understand it. So you've done a great job. I'll give you the rest of the time until we start hearing the music. What is modal collapse?
Yeah, I'll tell you what, Gary, when I first heard this too, I did not understand it. I just heard people saying modal collapse. I'm like, what do those words even mean? What is even going on here? So it's sometimes said that God's simplicity and immutability bring about a modal collapse. So I think first there's the task of figuring out what is this objection saying? And then second, there's the task of answering it. And so I don't expect everyone to know these words, so I'm going to kind of walk you through the basics of it. Some people might. And then I'll just give a brief answer with a punt to some episodes we've done on it. Okay. The word modal in modal collapse it's an adjective affixed to a proposition that is anything other than a simple fact. So commonly, modal claims deal with possibilities and necessities. So if I say, and I look outside, it's not raining outside here today in New Jersey, that's a simple fact. But if I say it is necessarily not raining outside, or it is possibly raining outside where I live. These are what we call, or philosophers call, modal claims. And there's this whole system of modal logic that gets into things. So that's just a basic definition of word. The modal collapse objection says that since God is absolutely simple, and since he is his one simple necessary act of being himself, or pure actuality, well then the product of that act, namely his creation, must also be absolutely necessary. So God must have created this world exactly as it was, and it's fatalistic in that everything that happens must occur of absolute necessity. There's no possibility or contingency baked into anything, because everything just absolutely flows from God's simple and unchangeable action of his nature. So therefore, any Christians who want to say that God's free to create, or that things happen freely in the world with free choice and so on, well, those are incompatible. So this is the objection. They say that those claims are incompatible with the God of classical theism, because he just had to create by his very nature.
Okay.
Does that make some sense?
Yeah. So we got maybe like a minute and a half. So
all right. So here's the real brief answer is just we're going to deny some of the claims that lead us there. And our brief response, Father Michael Dodd spells it out detailed in his book, The Unchanging God of Love, which I'll recommend to listeners, and we've done episodes with him. But we don't accept the claim that God's one divine act can only terminate in one effect. We say that we're just going to deny this principle. And some people have called it the difference principle, that says every difference in the effect must have a difference in the cause. We just deny that principle. And we say that such a principle doesn't apply to God's action, which is utterly unique and different. He's so powerful that he can bring about a myriad of effects, or none at all, without himself changing. It's similarly to how we answer the immutability objection. And there may be an analog in creaturely free will, where up to the point where humans choose freely, up to that moment of choice, they still have the power to choose X or Y. And then once they make that choice, well, they've chosen one decision. We could say God has an analogous sort of freedom where up until that moment of choice, he's absolutely the same, but it's just when he chooses, it terminates outside of himself. There's no mental acts or duration going on inside of his mind. His creation is extrinsic to himself. We call this the extrinsic model of God creating and of God knowing. And so the modal collapse objection, it can get technical, but it smuggles in a premise that classical theists can deny. And so the conclusion of modal collapse doesn't follow if we hold that by his one simple divine act, it's possible for him to bring out a myriad of contingent effects outside of himself. So that's a brief sketch, but they could see classicaltheism.com/episodes. We've had several guests on to help deal in more detail with that objection.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I know, because that is a pretty intimidating, you engage in modal collapse there. And most people, I think, would throw their hands up and say, I don't have a clue what you're saying. But it sounds very impressive, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay.
I was one of those people who threw my hands up, too.
Yeah. So, John, where can people go get your book?
classicaltheism.com/new book. And ton of great stuff there. Thanks, Gary, for having me on. It's been a blast.
All right. Thanks, John. And check it out, classicaltheism.com. Great stuff. Man, the hour has flown, but never fear. Terry and Jesse will soon be here with the Terry and Jesse Show. Thank you so much for tuning in. And God willing, we'll be back tomorrow to do this thing called Hands Up Apologetics. Everybody take care. Bye-bye.